Welcome back to Andersen Acres and our second episode of Farm Fights. And I've got Tequila here because I have an egg. And she would like an egg. You can't have an egg right now. But this is the series where, This is the series where we sit down and we talk about an issue that if you post it in a Facebook group of hobby farm people, it's going to get some arguments. So what we're talking about today is eggs. That's why I've got an egg and a dog who wants an egg. Can't have this egg. So we're talking about storing eggs specifically. This is a leghorn egg, by the way. If for whatever reason you go into a chicken group on Facebook or Reddit or wherever you happen to like to post things, and you ask, should I wash my eggs and put them in the fridge? Or should I not wash my eggs and leave them on the counter? You are going to get hateful people on both sides of that argument. You'll have people that tell you if you wash them and put them in the fridge, you're a terrible person and you are damaging your food and you should never do that. And on the other end, you're going to have people who tell you that if you leave an egg on the counter for more than 2 hours, you're going to die. Okay? You get both ends of the spectrum. And these people can be horrific. But the actual truth of it is somewhere in the middle. So let's talk about that somewhere in the middle. By the way, we're joined by Magic as well today. Over my shoulder here if you're watching the video. He's hanging out. But let's talk about eggs. And here's Pippin. We are joined by everyone. So let's talk about eggs, how they work, and how you should store them. So first of all, let's talk about the actual structure of an egg. Okay, we know that an egg has a yolk and a white, but we're not talking about yolks and whites today. We're talking about the shell. Now the shell looks solid. You tap it, your finger doesn't go through it, but it's actually incredibly porous. That porous nature is what allows an egg to hatch into a chick because it allows the air to get inside so that baby chick can breathe as it forms. And it allows moisture to escape so that baby chick doesn't drown when he's trying to hatch. So that porous nature of that eggshell is incredibly important. Okay, it is absolutely essential to the functioning of an egg. But it does pose a problem for people who are eating the egg. So if moisture and air can pass through that shell, so can bacteria. And this is where the wash it and refrigerate it comes from. Because yes, bacteria can pass through that shell. But there's another part to this egg. On top of the shell is a bloom. If you have ever watched your chicken lay an egg, you'll notice it looks almost moist when the egg is laid. It looks kind of damp, and then it dries. That moisture, and then when it dries, is the bloom. The bloom is a protective coating that prevents bacteria from entering the egg itself. This is again essential to the chick's development. Remember, these eggs were not developed so we could eat. They were developed as a means of reproduction for the chicken. So that bloom is essential to the developing chick. It protects the baby as it's developing from getting a bacterial infection. So if that wasn't the case, baby chicks would never hatch because bacteria would pass through that eggshell and the chick would get infected and die well before its 21 days are up. However, that bloom only stays intact if it doesn't get wet. Okay? The moment an egg gets wet, that bloom is damaged. That's why we don't wash our eggs before we hatch them. So anyone who tells you wash your eggs before you put them in the incubator is very misinformed because that bloom is essential for protecting that baby chick. Okay, so if you are hatching your eggs, you need to leave that bloom intact. You can't wash the egg. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about eggs for eating. Should you wash them and refrigerate them or leave them on the counter? That's where this bloom comes into play. So let's first talk about leaving them on the counter. This bloom does, for a period of time, protect the egg from any bacteria that might enter. And I say for a period of time because it was not meant to be a never-ending protection, okay? When you put an egg in your incubator, that bloom is intact for 3 weeks. And then that chick hatches and the bloom is no longer necessary. So a good rule of thumb is for 3 weeks, that egg is probably fine if it didn't get wet. Okay? It's probably fine on your counter for 3 weeks because that bloom was designed to stay intact for 3 weeks. Okay? So you are probably fine as long as your kitchen is not hot, is not humid, and you don't leave the eggs in direct sunlight. As long as those 3 things are generally true of your kitchen, you're probably fine to put them on a rack or in a basket on your counter. Okay? Because that bloom is protecting your egg. That bloom is not allowing bacteria into that egg. So it is safe for 3 weeks for sure, because that's how long blooms are designed to protect the chick. Therefore, that is definitely how long that bloom will protect you from eating an egg full of bacteria. Now, if your kitchen is too warm, so if it feels too warm to you, so you do a lot of baking, maybe your kitchen is very, very warm, then you don't want to store eggs on your counter. If your kitchen is very humid, some kitchens are, then you do not want to store eggs on your counter. Maybe you want to store them in a different room. Maybe you have a mud room that's a little bit cooler. And if your kitchen has a lot of direct sunlight, you don't want to store these in the sun. The sun will break down that bloom very fast. If this egg is laying out in the sun, even for 6 hours, that bloom is gone. Okay, UV light breaks down that bloom. That's one of the reasons chickens tend to lay their eggs in a protected, darker area, and then they sit on them. That bloom does not get exposed to a bunch of sunlight. That's really important. Okay, so if your kitchen is really, really sunny, you can't leave them on your kitchen island in the direct sunlight, or that bloom breaks down in about 6 to 8 hours. So if you have a sunny kitchen, a humid kitchen, or a hot kitchen, countertop storage is not your best bet. Okay. Let's now talk about, you have people in Europe who store, most of Europe and a lot of the world, store their eggs on the counter. Why then, in North America, do we wash them and refrigerate them? So, storing them on the counter, just like we talked about, is perfectly fine. The egg is clean, okay? The egg looks clean. There's no, I'm looking at it now, there's no dirt on it, it's not full of poop. So, it's pretty clean. And it probably doesn't need to be washed until I'm about to use it. So, I can leave it on my countertop for a few weeks, wash it right before I use it, crack, continue with my baking. Why then, in North America, do we wash them and refrigerate them? I want you to take a look at a map of Europe. Look at a population density map. Look at how many people there are who live, even if you live in a city, who would live close to an agricultural area where eggs might be produced. Now I want you to look at a map of North America. Do you notice how the population is way, way less density in North America? I'm Canadian. Our population density is ridiculous. So we're larger than the US square footage wise, but we have less people. And we have people concentrated in that strip right down in the southern part of our country, and the northern part is very sparsely populated. I live in the more northern part. Not far north, but I live outside of that band where people live. Okay, I live north of that. So I'm in a very sparsely populated area. So think then, if you're in Europe, and you are at an egg farm, how far is it from the egg farm to the store? And then how far is it from the store to your home? And the answer is not very. Okay, it's very, very short distances because Europe is not that big. Superimpose a map of Europe over a map of Canada. You don't even have to include the US, but just over a map of Canada. It's ridiculous how large North America is. So my eggs that if I were to buy them at the store, which sometimes I have to because my chickens are buttheads and it's winter, but if I buy my eggs at the store, they came from really far away. Okay, I live in a very, very isolated area. So there is not a commercial egg farm near me. There's not ever going to be. I live in an agricultural area, yes, but the area I live in is mostly cattle. Okay, most people have cattle here. There's lots of herds of cattle. And some sheep. There's not a lot of pigs. There's not a lot of chicken farms. Most of that is located quite far away from me. So the eggs that you buy at our local grocery store were not laid yesterday. okay? Our eggs can be weeks old before they reach the store. Now, ideally, they're not quite that old, but it can happen, especially in really remote communities. Those eggs can be really, really old, okay? And I'm not saying like months and months old, but they can be several weeks before the egg goes from the egg farm to the home of the person who bought the egg in those rural, remote northern communities. Those eggs can be quite old. Remember how we said that bloom only guarantees 3 weeks? Because that's what it was designed for biologically by the chicken. It was designed for 3 weeks. Most of those eggs are more than 3 weeks old. Europe and other areas that don't wash their eggs do not have that same issue. They don't have these great distances that these foods are traveling. So in order to preserve it the longest, absolute longest amount of time you can save this egg is if you wash it to remove any bacteria and then you put it in the fridge. So you will have some people say, well, what if I just put it in the fridge with the bloom intact? There's still bacteria on the outside of this egg, okay? Especially in North America, we have quite a lot of salmonella. That's not as big a problem in Europe, partially because they vaccinate their chickens for salmonella a lot of the time. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And we don't tend to do that here in North America. So there is bacteria on the outside of this egg. That's why you're supposed to wash them before you eat them. Even if you store them on your counter, when you pick up that egg to crack it into your cookies, you wash it first. That is proper food safety, proper food handling. Remove the bacteria from the outside of the egg, then crack the egg, and then continue with your baking. And frankly, I use a lot of eggs that haven't been in the fridge because I go through eggs at a fairly good clip. I use them up really fast. So usually an egg that my chicken laid this morning is probably used within 3 days. Usually the same day because I do a lot of baking and I do a lot of selling of eggs. So I don't have that many eggs to spare. I don't store them very long anymore. I used to. But these days, there's a lot of turnover with my eggs. So I don't store them very long. And that's okay. All right, that's fine. But if I was storing them longer, I would either leave them on the counter or I would wash them and refrigerate them. I would not put an unwashed egg in the fridge. And let me tell you why. Remember how we said this bloom, that beautiful bloom on that egg that protects that chick, is damaged by getting wet? What happens in the fridge? Your fridge is not a dry environment, okay? Put a hygrometer in there to measure the humidity in your fridge. It's not dry, okay? You will notice sometimes there's condensation on the outside of containers. Fridges are not a dry environment. Your countertop, unless your kitchen's really humid, is a dry environment. So an egg sitting on your countertop is not likely to get wet unless you dump water on it. Don't do that. But it's generally not likely to get wet. An egg in your fridge is having moisture condense on that shell. Moisture damages the bloom. Now bacteria can get into that egg. So if you are going to refrigerate them, wash them first. So when I have eggs that I'm using for my own personal consumption, and if for some ridiculous reason I've had them on the counter for 3 weeks, they then get washed and refrigerated. So I can continue to use them and not have any food safety risks. It is 100% a risk to use an egg that has been sitting on your countertop for 6 weeks and just been sitting there, okay? The bloom on this eggshell is not designed to protect the egg that long. The chick is going to hatch well before that time. So I would not use an egg that had been sitting on the counter more than 3 weeks. If I hit the 3-week mark, wash and refrigerate. So there's a lot of nuance in the answer to this question, okay? Because it's not as straightforward as either wash and refrigerate or put them on your counter. There's an in-between where you might want to leave them on your counter for a couple of weeks, and then if you don't use them, then you might want to wash and refrigerate them. The other issue is some of us sell eggs, okay? I sell eggs. And I am not going to break any local rules because if I break my local rules, I could get shut down. So my local rules say any egg sold for human consumption has to be washed and refrigerated and put in a clean carton. That's what I do with eggs I'm selling. Every single egg that leaves the farm here for human consumption is washed, refrigerated, and in a clean carton. I do not sell unwashed eggs for human consumption. Obviously, if I'm selling hatching eggs, I absolutely do not wash them because that damages the bloom and the chick will not develop properly because there's bacteria that will get in that egg. But if I'm selling them to eat, for people to eat, then I 100% wash and refrigerate because those are our local rules. Where you live, you might not have those local rules, but I strongly encourage you to follow your local rules so you do not get in trouble. Our local rules say I have to wash them and refrigerate them if I'm selling them. And part of that is the distance again. People might be traveling fairly far with their eggs. And you have to remember that in North America, it's a cultural norm to not wash your eggs when you take them out of the fridge because they're already pre-washed. If you're not someone who raises birds and keeps your eggs on the counter, and therefore you keep your egg on the counter, you know you have to give it a quick wash before you use it. If you're in North America, you're used to just using the egg. You're used to it just being clean. So because that is the cultural norm where I'm from, if I gave people eggs, okay, that were not washed, they would probably forget to wash them because it's not common for us to wash an egg before we use it, unless you grow up on a farm or you have a farm now and you've made a conscious decision, I'm going to leave my eggs on the counter and then I'm just going to wash them quick before I bake my cookies. For the most part, that is not a common thing. Okay, it's not common at all for people to wash an egg before they use it. If you live somewhere where eggs on the shelf is normal and you store them on your countertop, then you're already quite used to washing that egg before you use it. And yes, you are supposed to be washing your egg before you use it. Whether you wash and refrigerate or store on your counter, at some point that egg needs to be washed. Again, bacteria. Remember, this comes out of a chicken's butt. There is bacteria on it. Whether you like to admit that or not, there's bacteria on it. Wash your egg. Whether you wash and refrigerate or leave it on your counter, you need to wash that egg before you eat it. Okay? Wash it. It's really important. Up until now, we've been talking about chicken eggs. Let's talk about some other types of eggs. And then we'll get back to when you absolutely should wash and refrigerate your egg, your chicken eggs. But let's talk for a minute about duck eggs. Because sometimes people ask this. Should I wash and refrigerate my duck eggs or leave them on the counter? Well, that depends. So this egg in my hand is a leghorn egg. Okay, this egg I've been holding this entire video. This is a leghorn egg. It has not been washed. It is fresh, laid this morning. Okay? Beautiful. Beautiful egg. It is completely clean. Even if I hold it up to the camera, clean egg. Okay? Very clean egg. Not a mark on it. Came right out of the nest box, pristine. There's not really a reason to wash this egg until I use it. I can just leave it on my counter. I'm baking cookies as soon as I'm done filming this. So I will be using this egg imminently. So there's really no reason for me to wash it and put it in the fridge. It's 100% clean and I'm going to be using it in the next 3 weeks. Obviously, I'm going to be using it in the next 3 hours. So I don't have any reason to wash that. Have you ever seen a duck egg come out clean? No. Ducks, I have ducks. I love my ducks. They are fantastic ducks. They're also disgusting. Okay? I love everything about my ducks except how disgusting they are. If you look at a freshly laid chicken egg like this, it is pretty pristine unless the chicken laid it somewhere they shouldn't or you have dirty nest boxes. But in general, most of the chicken eggs you collect are going to be pretty clean. There are a few exceptions, but if you are a responsible chicken keeper who is keeping your nest boxes clean and keeping your coops clean, and your eggs are probably pretty clean. You might end up with a poop smear here and there on one of them, but generally the eggs I pull out of my coop look pristine. The eggs I get from the ducks, who are not laying right now because it's the middle of winter and this is not their season to lay, but when they are laying, they're not clean. Ducks tend to lay their eggs wherever they darn well please. Our ducks are not fond of using a nest box unless they're in the mood to hatch eggs. And if they're not in the mood to hatch eggs, you're going to find eggs in the middle of the field. It's just the way they are. And those eggs tend to be really dirty. Think about how dirty ducks are. They splash in the water, they roll in the mud. Ducks are dirty, dirty creatures. Their eggs are just as dirty. Most of the time when you grab a duck egg, it's just disgusting. It's streaked with mud, it's got duck poop on it, it's been walked on by the ducks because they're not exactly careful. They're disgusting. Remember how we said that bloom can protect, but if it gets wet, it's damaged? Duck eggs have a bloom. However, duck feet are wet because they've been splashing in the water. Duck poop is mostly water. Have you ever seen duck and goose poop? It's a slurry. It's like a sludge. It's mostly water. That duck egg, unless it is 100% pristine, which it's probably not because ducks are gross, that duck egg is already teeming with bacteria, and that bloom is damaged. That bloom already got wet. Ducklings are not chicks. Their eggs are built differently, okay? They have an entirely different system than a chicken. And duck eggs are gross. Generally, a duck lays eggs for hatching, and those might be pretty clean, but if she's not in the mood to hatch, they're going to be gross. If your eggs are gross, you need to wash them and refrigerate them. Okay? They're gross. And no, taking a little sandpaper to sandpaper off the muck doesn't actually work because that sandpaper damages the bloom. So you will have a lot of people tell you, well, just use a little bit of sandpaper or a rough cloth to remove it. But if you did that, you're also sanding off the bloom. And there is absolutely no way for you to use sandpaper and promise yourself, guarantee to yourself, that you didn't also sandpaper off that bloom. That bloom is really, really thin. Okay? It's so ridiculously thin, it's almost not there at all. So there's no way to use sandpaper to remove mud and muck from an egg and leave the bloom intact. It's not going to happen. So duck eggs, unless they're pristine, wash them, refrigerate them. Unless you're hatching them. If you're hatching them, keep them in a cool, dark place until you're ready to put them in the incubator. But otherwise, yeah, duck eggs are gross. If you have ducks and geese and you are using those eggs for human consumption, definitely wash and refrigerate them. And by the way, I love duck eggs. I use duck eggs in a lot of my baking when my ducks are laying because they're fantastic. I love duck eggs. But they're also gross. A gross egg needs to be cleaned. So if you have ducks or geese and you're using their eggs for eating, most of us don't eat goose eggs, we hatch them, but you might be someone who likes to eat them. You need to wash and refrigerate those, unless they're pristine. Circling back to chicken eggs, that same rule applies to chickens. Most of the eggs you find are going to be nice and clean. Chickens tend to be fairly clean, so those eggs are fairly clean. Every once in a while, especially if you have a dirty coop or if there's been a lot of rain lately, it's been very mucky, you might end up with eggs from your chickens that are also pretty gross. If those eggs are gross, if there is poop on them, if there's any blood on them, which happens sometimes when an egg is laid, sometimes an egg is laid in an awkward position or the egg's just a little bit too large and the hen bleeds a little, it happens. It's not a dire situation unless it's happening every day, but it happens. So if you have poop or blood or dirt on your chicken egg, that egg should be washed and refrigerated. Again, there is no way to remove that poop and dirt and a little bit of blood without damaging the bloom. I know people will say, well, I like to use sandpaper. Awesome, but you damage the bloom. So it is not safe, okay? It is not safe from a food safety and bacteria standpoint to damage that bloom and then leave it on the counter. So if your eggs are dirty or they got wet, whether they're chicken or not, wash them and refrigerate them. If your eggs are in good condition, pristine, you've inspected it visually, no cracks, there's no cracks in this one here, no cracks, no dirt, no poop, nice and pristine, looking pretty, then put them on your counter. Or wash and refrigerate if you prefer. Some people like to do either all or nothing. They don't like to have some eggs on the counter and some eggs in the fridge. So a lot of people will just be like, I'm just going to wash them, refrigerate them right now. And that's fine too. You can absolutely do that. Or you can leave them on your counter if they're clean and in good condition. You don't mix your methods. Like we talked about before, the moisture in your fridge will drive the bacteria on the eggshell into the egg. That's what will happen because the moisture is going to damage that bloom. That bloom is what allows you to store that egg on the counter. So that bloom is powerful, it's excellent, but it can be damaged. If it was damaged, the egg needs to get washed and refrigerated. So I hope that clears that up. There's really no reason to fight about it because you can either wash them and refrigerate them or leave them on your counter. It's up to you. As long as the eggs are clean and in good condition, there's no reason you have to wash and refrigerate them in those first few weeks. And let's face it, most of us don't have eggs that are 4 or 5 weeks old sitting around. Most of us have enough eggs to feed our family or enough eggs to feed our family and then sell, depending on what our goals are. Very few of us are going to have eggs that are multiple weeks old sitting on our counter. If you have eggs that are 4+ weeks old and you haven't used them, you might want to reevaluate how many hens you have and do you really need that many laying hens? Because you probably don't. I have never had an egg that was 4 weeks old. I barely have an egg that's 4 hours old. That's why there's not a lot of eggs in my videos, because they get used so quickly. In fact, I probably need more hens myself. But if you find yourself overwhelmed with eggs, you might want to look into downsizing the number of hens you have because you probably don't need that many hens. There's no reason to have an egg sitting around for a month ready to be used because you should eat them or use them. Do something with them. Turn them into Easter eggs. It doesn't matter. Do something with them. An egg sitting on the counter for 4 weeks, it's not safe to consume. It might be fine. A lot of people say, I've eaten eggs 6 weeks old that were on the counter. Excellent. I'm glad you didn't get sick. But once you get past that 3-week mark, you are running a risk. So 3 weeks on the counter, if you haven't eaten them, wash them and refrigerate them. And if that happens a lot, reevaluate how many laying hens you have. You might not need as many as you've got. Anyway, that's about it for us here today at Andersen Acres. We'll see you tomorrow.